Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of my NISEI board member interview series. I am here last and certainly not least with Zack Bauermeister, the president of Project NISEI. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan. I'm really happy to be on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, we're kind of ending with, you know, somebody that maybe has a more enigmatic position. A lot of the other positions within the enterprise are pretty specific. Yours is a little bit more generalized, so I think our audience is going to be interested to know where the leadership role lays and what exactly your people should expect from you going forward. So we're going to dig into that today. But
Sure.
first, tell me a little bit about your Netrunner story, Zach. How did you start playing this game that we are all obsessed with called Android Netrunner?
Sure. Netrunner came out like pretty much right when I was in like final exams for my last year of college. uh, so I was pretty busy and also had no money. Uh,
Winning combination.
yeah. So I actually was like 3 or 4 months behind the rest of the train on getting into Netrunner.
Okay.
So I picked up the core set. I was very excited about it. And so I met up with my cousin who he's not like super into like traditional games and stuff. He's more of a video game player, but sometimes I can get him to play a game with me. And so we whipped out the core set pre-constructed decks and played a game. And it was so fun that we then played all 12 possible matchups and then realized that we hadn't eaten anything all day. So we went out for dinner. But that was like my first Netrunner experience, was just playing 12 straight games of Netrunner with my cousin.
Wow.
Yeah. After that, I got some data packs. I saw there was a regional at a local game store, and I went down there. I actually played a game against Jacob Morris, the rules manager, that at that tournament. uh, and after that, we were just like, all right, thanks for the game. But then I saw him again later at another store, and we started hanging out. So
That's really cool.
yeah.
So when you think about Netrunner, obviously, you kind of dove in hard with the core set right away, but besides your obvious contributions just so far with Nisei and what's going to happen going forward, is there anything that our community might know you for from previously, like as far as like tournaments or content things that you might have done in the past?
Sure. So I mostly stayed pretty quiet on the internet during my like Netrunner experience. I participated a lot in like local tournament organization and stuff like that. Uh, I did create 2 decks that I think a lot of people have maybe seen, and one of them I won a store champ with. So I made a deck that I'm sure other people had come up with the idea, but I hadn't seen any of it on Netrunner DB before I posted mine. That I like to call Beal or No Beal, which
It's
is
a great deck.
I think that it's never really quite had its chance to shine, but I did win a store championship with Beal or No Beal once. I think I actually went undefeated with it. My runner was kind of dragon. Uh, but yeah, so mooshing out Beals and or Cerebral Overriders all day was pretty fun. The other deck that I think at least some people have seen, I don't know how many people, was I called it the Oscars. I think I've seen other people call it some other variations on award shows, but it's a PE deck and it has the board. I mentioned it, I think, in the interview RC did when we first started the Nisei stuff. Uh, Basically, you trick your opponent into thinking that you were going to accelerated diagnostics combo them, and you actually couldn't have done, and then they run archives and die because you had the board on the table. That one's pretty good. I feel like that's probably my greatest contribution to the community, at least.
It's not bad. It's not bad. So, Zach, tell me a little bit about, you know, somebody or what is your favorite corp card and your favorite runner card?
Sure. I I think everybody knows my favorite corp card at this point is Mushin Notion. Some people think that Mushin Notion is anti-fun, and I think that those people just haven't had the right experience with it yet, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get to know something, and I think Mushin is one of those things. My favorite runner card is a lot trickier. I think it's sort of a tie. I really like all of the stuff that came for Shaper and Creation and Control. I just remember like playing Netrunner and being like, this is cool, and then Creation and Control came out, and you get self-modifying code and clone chip, and all these effects that let you like make decisions during the run that are outside of the cards that you have in play. And I remember thinking that was really, really fun. So yeah, I think it's sort of a tie between self-modifying code and clone chip.
Yeah. I enjoy self-modifying code a fair bit, as you may have gathered by the fact that it's the name of the channel.
Yeah. It's definitely, you know, it just gives you a lot of cool options.
Yeah. So, talk to me a little bit about what it means to be the president of Project NISEI, and, you know, like, what's your role moving forward from NISEI, with NISEI taking over for FFG?
Sure. So there's a lot of stuff that is explicitly a part of my role. That includes, you know, sort of coordinating the rest of the board, making sure that things are sort of known schedule, right? So that we can predict when different things are going to be ready, predict when different things need to be ready, and things like that. And also just sort of general like business management stuff, since we are technically like required to be registered as a business organization, making sure that our nonprofit status is maintainable. Filing our taxes, you still have to file taxes even as a tax exempt organization. So I'm helped in doing that by our treasurer, Nicholas, who is really good. So I don't have to worry too much about like all the actual paperwork, but making sure that we stay on top of that stuff and making sure that things that we're doing are, you know, legal, and that they're things that aren't going to upset like different intellectual property holders and things like that are a big part of what I'm doing. There's also a lot of stuff that's not necessarily explicitly a part of what my role is, but just implicitly. So I try to sort of keep a like high up, you know, in the air view of what we're doing, and make sure that people aren't duplicating work, make sure that everyone's sort of aware of the things that they need to be aware of to be productive.
Sure.
Making sure that the game is going in a direction that myself and the rest of the board all feels is effective, and making sure that we communicate when we think that it's not. And I also sometimes, you know, have to like step in and mediate disputes and things like that if there isn't someone more appropriate to do so. So I sort of am trying to like fill in gaps wherever I see them. If there's stuff that we need that needs to be done that no one else is necessarily able to do or has time to do or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah. So I gotta stop using the word "so" as my transition. What is something that the community can kind of, you know, a lot of what you're going to be doing, as you say, is going to be kind of behind the scenes, more people management, you know, your output is smooth operations for NISEI as a whole. But is there anything that you can think of that the community can kind of look to as something that they can expect to see from you in the future?
Yeah, sure. So things that they can see from me, I like to. So I am on Stim Slack. My name on Stim Slack is just Zack, ZAC. So if people have a concern that they want to share with me, I'm available. I might not respond for a little bit, just because I have a lot of stuff that I have to get to sometimes. But I can guarantee that I will read it pretty much right away. I also, yeah, I mean, I'm even if I'm not directly the person that you're talking to or interacting with, I try to keep an eye on like anything that is publicly facing that we're doing. So I try to read all the articles that we post and make sure that they're in line with sort of the message that we're trying to express. Anytime that you like talk to our Facebook page, for example, like I'm not usually answering those. Sometimes I do because I like to be sneaky like that. But I am reading all of them. So if you feel like you have something important to say, please feel free to say it. If you don't want to say it to me, you can say it to anybody on the team. We have a Project NISEI at gmail.com email that all of the board members have access to. So that's another great Dropbox to use to get us information.
That's really good. What is the message in your mind that NISEI is trying to convey?
So there's sort of two core pieces to it to me. The first is that we're going to do everything that we can to maintain the level of support that FFG has given the game. So in that vein, we're continuing organized play support on exactly the same schedule that FFG had maintained. We just, I believe, a couple days ago stopped sales for game night kits. We'll be announcing store championship kits in the next, I think, month or two. So we're definitely working really hard to like maintain that pace and make sure that we don't skip a step. We're also, so like that part of the message is just that if you were an enfranchised Netrunner player and would like to continue to be, like, you shouldn't notice a difference. You should just continue. You should be able to just continue playing the game exactly how you had been. The only differences that I think you'll notice are ones that are sort of hard for us to control. Like sometimes players will see the official support for the game end and drop off. So you might see that. You'll not see information about the game in stores anymore because we have a difficult way, or we have no way really to interact with local game stores other than ones that we run events with. So that being said, the other half of the message, besides just if you like Netrunner and want to keep playing it, you can, is we're trying to make it really easy for everybody to introduce people to the game. I think that that's something that has been a difficult problem to solve for Netrunner for a long time. And so the other big half of our mission is to like make good entry level experiences, and to make like tools that the community can use to introduce new players. It's difficult because it's not something that we can do by ourselves necessarily, right? We don't have a box sitting on a shelf in a store for people to catch people's eye, right?
Well, I think, if I might jump in, I think,
of course.
I think one of the biggest things with teaching people Netrunner, and I know this from my own experience, just locally trying to learn the game events in the past, one of Netrunner's greatest assets, as far as like one of the things that makes the game most exciting and unique, is the asymmetry and face down cards, and that's one of the things that also creates this huge barrier of entry. Of knowledge for people to be able to learn the game, because so much of what makes the game exciting is trying to anticipate what the face down cards are for the corp, but that requires you have card pool knowledge. So it's simultaneously one of the greatest assets of the game, and it's also something that is like a knowledge check for players.
Right. It is a really hard problem to solve. So I know that myself and many other members of NISEI that I've spoken to all sort of agree that it is a hard problem to solve, and sort of the only way we can think of to solve it is by encouraging players to explore that space, even if you can't necessarily tell them exactly what to expect. My favorite matchup to teach players the game is Gabe versus HB. Usually ETF, just because ETF encourages players to install a bunch of stuff, and Gabe encourages players to run all that stuff and see what it is. But yeah, it's definitely a hard problem to solve. We've been trying to just sort of decrease the barrier to getting to that point as much as possible, by making like sort of overall product design decisions that allow players to participate in the game without necessarily knowing every card in the game or like even building a deck. Sure. A big thing that we've been trying to do with our first actual like in-house design is to make it like a playable out-of-the-box experience. So basically, I don't know that all of this is completely set in stone. We're still sort of figuring out some of the details. But the basic idea is it's a series of dual decks that are designed to be played against each other. And again, there might also be some supplemental aspects to this. But pretty much, instead of needing to know the entire card pool, you just sort of can learn those decks and how they interact with each other and learn the game one chunk at a time instead of needing to know everything at once.
I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I think it also, I've noticed there's this huge barrier, which is deck building, right? And most of the products that exist for the game right now are fodder for that activity. And it's obviously really important because constructed play is like sort of the end point of the Netrunner experience. Like that's where you get to and then you stay. And that's like the loop that you participate in. But I think that leading up to that, there are a lot of stumbling points. And definitely like getting into deck building is one of them. So we're trying to like add some more stepping stones along the way that you can participate in before you get to full standard constructed.
Yeah, and there's so many things that are just not obvious until you've played a lot of games, right? Like I remember just from my own experience getting into stuff, hanging out with the Philly group and a lot of the highly competitive people and highly successful players that are in there. And then, you start really building decks for yourself, and they're like, you need to have like at least 12 money cards in a deck, right?
Yeah.
And it's not something that you think about, right? Or it's just like, oh, like your ice strength, this was back in the day of Ottman, of course, but it's just like you have too many ice of 4 strength or too many ice of 5 strength. And those are things that, unless you're really kind of being a thoughtful player, you're going to lose games and you're not necessarily going to know exactly why unless you're somebody who's really being really observant until you, like you say, it's a stumbling block because until you know all of the kind of underlying systems inside of Netrunner's multiple economies, you may not even know why your decks aren't working.
Right. And that's like not even touching on the fact that there's a bunch of strategic elements to how you use your money, right? Like maybe you have enough money in your deck, but you're, spending all of it for your last click. That's the common mistake that I see when I teach people the game, right? Is they sit there and they make a bunch of money and then click 4, they install Femme Fatale or something. And it's just like, that gives me so many more options as the corp on my turn. Yeah, definitely there's a lot of steps to sort of figuring out the space that Netrunner occupies.
I agree.
Yeah.
Looking at your own time playing the game, what makes an ID enjoyable for you to play, and what's your favorite runner and corp identities?
Sure. So it's hard for me to answer that without like the lens of game design touching on it, since I've designed some games and think about that a lot. I would say that what makes an identity most fun for me is that it's specific without pigeonholing itself into one set of cards, right? Like you want it to be an ability that feels unique and that doesn't just help you sort of with a generic value add, but you also want it to be a deck that doesn't build itself, right? So I think in that light, my favorite corp ID is probably Jinteki Biotech. I just feel like it's really versatile. It has a lot of really interesting hidden information involved. I feel like there could be some more support for it, right, to make it even more interesting, just because the Archives one is like not usually what you're picking unless a matchup makes you pick it. But I do think that like it just feels like a really unique, interesting ability, and there's a lot of different ways you can build the deck.
Okay.
For runner, it's a little trickier. I actually really like Akiko Nisei. Um, I think that the influence short makes her difficult to build for. But I think that the ability synergizing with Nyashia and stuff like that, and like triggering these abilities that are sort of very specifically worded, is kind of fun. And I think that there's a lot of different strategies that you can take with that deck. You can be like very aggressive. You can try to lock them out of key cards by accessing R&D constantly. Um, yeah, I just think that there's a lot of space there without it feeling like, HBETF that just says gain a credit every turn.
Or the green version of that, which is Kate
Yeah.
McCaffrey.
That's right.
But yeah, I like that. So, on that note, is there an identity that is in the current card pool or was in the previous card pool that you wish had landed and people had utilized more, but you felt just kind of like never saw its day in the sun?
Sure. Yeah, actually. So I did see a local player build like a reasonably successful deck with this. Um, oh my god, I'm actually blanking on the name of the ID, but it's the NBN ID that is, you basically just always have a current out.
Oh, New Angela Soul.
That's the one. I've seen so many interesting uses of that card, and like none of them ever quite hit the sweet spot of being able to like consistently win a game. But like I think the one that I saw that I liked the most was just you perpetually have. I'm being very bad at card names right now, but the current that's 2 credits to steal an agenda.
Predictive algorithm.
Predictive algorithm. That's the one. Yeah. Perpetual predictive algorithm was very fun. And there are some other examples of currents you can play with it that are cool.
I feel like New Angela Soul and that specific combo did have like a kind of a blip moment, but that was also when NAPD was also in the card pool, so you could make NAPD without Film Critic cost 6 to steal, which feels very, very bad.
Yeah, that's pretty expensive.
Yeah, that's pretty expensive, yeah.
Nice.
So, when you think about, this kind of high level, facilitation and management role that you're in, what drew you to that position? What excites you about being in this role?
Sure. It's so I think that I have a lot of experience that I can use to be effective in the role. And just like also I've worked on skills that are useful for this role for a while. So I've been sort of a game designer, product manager role in some card game projects before. I've done some other business development stuff for another startup. And I generally like have a lot of existing knowledge about like the laws, at least in my region of the world, for legally operating something that's like fairly large scale and has people doing work and stuff like that. As far as what excited me about the role, like I've basically spent a lot of time thinking about Netrunner, and obviously like I love Netrunner. I think FFG just sort of perpetually did a really impressive job of pushing the game to its limits and like making it a really interesting experience for all of the existing players and things like that. There were obviously some hiccups along the way, but like I really loved the game throughout Fantasy Flight Stewardship. But I also was sort of on the ground, right? Like, so I was hearing the ways in which people left the game and why they left the game. I was hearing the ways in which people struggled with getting other people interested in the game. And it was very frustrating to not be able to do anything about that because I was constantly, talking with very smart people and thinking about it and having all these ideas for how we could make the game more accessible or how we could make the game more competitively interesting, things like that. And so it's really, really exciting for me to have an opportunity to share those ideas with people that can make that difference and to help to enact the changes that make that difference happen.
Okay. Now, obviously, we're not, the business of the Nisei board thus far and going forward is never going to be to kind of cast shade on the official FFG period of time. But
Right.
can you maybe illuminate a way in which you think that NISEI as an organization is going to be able to engage the community or do something for the game that maybe FFG wasn't able to do because of structure or how they're laid out as a corporation? Is there something that you think that NISEI uniquely is going to be able to do that FFG could not?
Sure. So I think that there are two big differences in our structure and their structure. The first is we don't need to worry about like existing intellectual property holders. So Fantasy Flight, as at least if my knowledge of how IP licenses work, probably needed to work pretty closely with Wizards of the Coast and maybe even with Artel Saurian, who owns the trademark for the name Netrunner, in probably every aspect of the game and the marketing for the game. And that probably impacted a lot of stuff, from the content that they were able to produce to the rate at which they were able to release it, and like when those releases would be announced, and how they were able to disseminate information about the game. So we don't have those restrictions, since we're sort of operating in good faith rather than being license holders, right? We also are completely volunteer staffed, and as such, none of us are getting paid. And the really interesting thing about that is it means we're actually like a much larger organization than Fantasy Flight Games in terms of our support of specifically Netrunner. So most people who follow the game closely probably are aware that the design and development team for Netrunner at FFG was no more than 2 people at any given time. For a long time, it was Lucas by himself, then it was Lucas and Damon, and then it was just Damon by himself, and then Michael Boggs. But one person designing and developing all of the cards.
That's a huge burden for one person. It's a huge
burden. Yeah, you're like, I'm very perpetually impressed with the quality of content that a single or 2 individuals were able to produce for the game, especially on such a tight schedule. We have like a design team and development team that's at least 10 times the size that was on the game previous to this, and maybe some of them aren't as like on paper experienced as the people that were working on it at that time, but they're all really, really smart and really good designers and really good developers. Our organized play team is like incredibly well organized, and they're doing like a lot of kind of incredible work in the amount of time that they've done it so far. And given the fact that the schedule will loosen up a bit in the next few months, since we were sort of on our back foot getting started for the game night kits, we'll definitely just see quality of those products continue to increase. So I think that those 2 aspects definitely give us sort of like an edge in terms of like engaging the community and making content that allows people to get into the game and continue to play the game.
Yeah, I think those are 2 really solid upsides. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. You know, when you have when you're license holders and you're paying people, things get murky as far as involving unpaid people in that work, and then you have issues of disclosure, or as you say, information potentially being leaked to the public before you're legally able to share it with the public. So it really limits how many people can be involved in the process, and that basically restricts it to the people who are directly being compensated for that work, because those are the people that you can get to sign contracts, sign strong non-disclosures, whereas everyone who's involved with NISEI, it's a labor of love, and there's no consideration there. So ostensibly, anybody who's talented and responsible can be involved in the process to some degree.
Yes, as long as you are able to work with people and love Netrunner pretty much, and you want to be involved, you can. And also, so this varies from state to state in the United States. I'm not super familiar with what the laws are in other places, but at least in Washington State, where I live, a for-profit company is not legally allowed to have volunteer workers. So it's like a huge advantage that we get from being not-for-profit and being volunteer staffed.
Right. Absolutely. Obviously, you're someone who would be drawn to this type of position, not just because of your experience, but because Netrunner, its community, spoke to you in some way, really engaged you in some way. Is there any specific moment that you'd like to kind of shine a light on as a favorite that you have in your time in the community?
Sure. So there was a period of time, a couple of years into the game, during FFG's stewardship, that they did this tour. It was called the Plugged In Tour. They basically went around to like sort of local game store hubs all over the country, and I think they did an equivalent tour in some other countries. I don't think it was super well dispersed, but basically they had some members of the design and development team and some members of the organized play team come around and like hang out at game stores and play games with people, and people could talk to them and ask them questions. And they had sort of like, it was basically just a very casual tournament. Like prize support was distributed based mostly on non-competitive metrics. There wasn't a top cut or anything like that. It was just like a couple of rounds of Swiss. So you just got to play some games, and eventually you were playing against people around your skill level. It was generally just a really well put on, welcoming event. And I remember just seeing a lot of people who aren't sort of the stereotypical card game player enjoying the game that I really like. And that was really, really impactful to me, to like see all of these people who aren't just like the people that I see every day, you know, like
Sure.
hanging out and like enjoying Netrunner, and seeing that it wasn't just like a game that is for sort of, you know, nerdy white guys like me. And seeing that it was more just like a game anybody could play and have fun with. And that was really affirming for things that I want to work towards, you know?
Yeah, and I remember the Plugged In tour really feeling like a humanizing moment for Netrunner and FFG compared to, you know, the titan in the marketplace, Magic the Gathering. Like, the idea that, like, you know, at that time, Damon and Lucas are just available in local game stores, and were just out there making sure that people were having fun, kind of right as Netrunner was ascending in popularity, and, you know, signing cards and saying hi to people and answering design questions was just this wild thing for me, because the idea of that ever happening in Magic is just like unfathomable. Like, you would never have access like that to a lead developer or a lead designer. And it reminded me how scrappy FFG was at that time, right? Like, we forget now that FFG was a pretty small company. Like, Netrunner really kind of launched, Netrunner and the Star Wars licenses kind of launched FFG into like being a larger hitter in the marketplace.
Definitely.
So how do we replicate these types of moments? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I remember the Plugged In tour was definitely a moment. It was like, it wasn't just like a feeling. It was just like the moment when I quantitatively realized that Netrunner was being made by two people, basically, right? Like, as far as the actual game design went.
Right. So how do we replicate? You know, you and a couple other board members mentioned the Plugged In tour and how impactful that event was. So how do we replicate something like that in a post like commercial world?
Right. So NISEI is, by its nature, a much more distributed organization than Fantasy Flight Games was at the time. So there are NISEI members all over the world. We're also planning, so by that nature, people, you know, might have more opportunities to see us. We don't have any plans right now to like do something explicit like the Plugged In tour, where like people show up at a spot and it's organized ahead of time, but that is definitely something we should think about, because that was a really great experience. We are planning, though, on breaking the pattern that FFG established that Worlds is always at FFG headquarters in Minnesota, which is not a super accessible place for most people that play Netrunner. So we're going to be having Worlds. We're going to try to have Worlds in a different country and maybe even a different continent every year. So this next coming Worlds is going to be in Europe. And we'll see what happens after that. We've been taking a lot of community feedback to determine, what the next location should be. So if that's something that you are interested in and passionate about, like competing at the highest level, you should make sure that you let us know where you are and where you would like Worlds to be.
Yeah.
And we'll also all be there, so or at least most of us, hopefully. So if you want to say hi to people that make the game or the new cards or do organized play or anything like that, Worlds would be a great place to do that.
Yeah, Worlds is an incredible experience. I don't think that there's anything quite like it, and I'm personally excited to see what it looks like under NISEI management.
I think it's going to be pretty good. I'm very excited about what I've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be wonderful just to also have it in the European theater instead of stateside, just because I think that there is a huge community in Europe for the game, and just because of the realities, we only see a fraction of them every year.
Yep. I have a number of friends over in the UK and in other areas in Europe that play Netrunner a lot. I don't get to see them even at Worlds most of the time. So it'll be nice to be able to hang out. Also, Europe just has a lot of really beautiful places to hang out. I mean, I love American wildlife and wilderness and stuff, but I don't get to leave the country that often, so it'll be nice.
Yeah. Moving forward, when you consider the future of Netrunner, and you have this kind of high level view, what are some of the challenges that you think we're going to face with NISEI as a whole moving forward?
Sure. So there are two huge challenges. I'm always with having two examples of things, I guess. That's been my pattern. The first is that as a non-commercial endeavor, we'll have a slightly harder time like delivering content, right? Because art is expensive and printing is expensive and things like that. So one of the challenges that we have is like figuring out ways to establish relationships with artists such that we can make more use out of their work, basically. So having an artist commissioning a piece from an artist and being able to use it in a few different ways for the game, like on multiple cards or something like that, is a big way that we're going to try and combat that problem. We have some artists on the team, obviously, but it just turns out that one card set has so many pieces in it that it's going to be difficult for us to do it all by ourselves.
Sure.
And so being able to raise those funds because we also really firmly believe in compensating artists fairly, and I know that that's a big problem in some other parts of our industry and adjacent industries, is how artists are dealt with as far as like compensation and licensing rights and stuff like that. So we're trying to be really good about that. And so we don't want to just be like, we want to make sure that when we're commissioning art, we're really commissioning art and paying the right rates and things like that. We don't want to take advantage of people's passion for the game or the fact that we're a volunteer organization to try and get a deal. We want to because I think that supporting artists is like just as important of a community effort as continuing to support organized play or continuing to make cards. Like the artists are a part of the community. We should be supporting them just like we support other players.
I agree. I think that's a very good stance to have.
Yeah.
I think of, you mentioned multi-use art. People watching at home, if you go take a look, if you search for the artist whose name is eluding me right this second, and I apologize, who did the itinerant protesters art, if you go to their art station, that's actually a mural. An FFG chopped it into 3 pieces, and like the leftmost section of it is itinerant protesters. The center section is for another card, and then the rightmost section where they're all standing around the computer screen is Oh no, the middle section is showing off, and then the
Yeah.
rightmost section is run amok. So it's like this huge Anarch mural of these different Anarch figures on a rooftop. And, they bought one piece of art and then chopped it into 3 square pieces to use it on 3 different cards. Which I think is like a really neat thing that I never realized before, that it was one continuous piece of art, all 3 of these cards.
Yeah. So another big hurdle that we face, aside from just not being a commercial endeavor, since that obviously makes things really hard, is we also, as I think I previously mentioned, don't have any way to have like a store presence other than events that stores run for us. So when FFG was making the game, right, there's perpetually boxes of the core set on shelves, which are very eye-catching, right? Really good job on marketing for the front of the box. It looks like a really fun game. You look at it and you read the back. So we don't have that advantage anymore, because we obviously, for reasons of we are acting in good faith and don't actually own the IP to the game mechanics and things like that, can't have a product available on a shelf. And I think that is the primary entry point for new players. The secondary one probably is a friend. So we lose that first biggest burst of people figuring out about the game.
Right, you lose the walk-ins, right?
Right.
Or you lose the storefront walk-ins. If somebody walks into a player space, the thing that's often happened where we've been playing and people think that we're playing Magic, so they come up and they're like, "Oh, what kind of decks are you playing?" And then they're like, "Wait, what is this game that you're playing?" Right?
Yep. I've gotten that a few times.
So, how can the community help? I think probably of the 2 challenges, the second one is probably the one that the community can help with the most. What would you say is the number one thing that people watching at home can do to increase Netrunner's visibility?
Sure. So it's something that a lot of players already do, but not everybody, which is to sort of evangelize the game, right? Like, get people excited about it through your excitement, and like show them the game and be like, man, I've been playing this game. It's really fun. And like, don't hide your nerdy hobby, right? If you have coworkers who are at all interested in games, you should tell them about Netrunner. Also helping us to disseminate like there is information, right, that's much more heavily marketed that the game is dead, right? Because FFG posted this article that says they're not producing it anymore. The game disappeared off shelves. It's a much easier message to hear than the message that there is a community organization that's dedicated to continuing to maintain it. So anytime you hear people talking about how, oh, it's a shame that you can't play Netrunner anymore, or like there's not going to be any more tournaments, be nice about it, but let them know, right, that that's not necessarily true. Like, if they want to play Netrunner, they don't need to find something else to do with their time.
Sure. And there was also a couple of troubling, just kind of low-hanging fruit articles that a couple of game writers wrote right after the announcement, or in the last couple months. Like, I know that there was at least one on Kotaku and also one on Polygon, where various staff writers were like, "Oh, it's the end of an era," and did a retrospective on Netrunner with no reference to the attempts to continue the game, or Nisei's stewardship of the game going forward. And I'm just like, thank you, someone outside of the community writing an article about our game is dead.
Yeah, it can be definitely very frustrating to see that, especially when they have such a wide viewership. I think it's hard to really blame them, right? Because a lot of those were written a while ago. I think that a lot of those larger outlets have a pretty long cycle on an article, unless it's something that's breaking news.
Sure.
But yeah, it's definitely frustrating, and it's difficult to combat against the sort of misinformed, larger space articles that aren't necessarily from within the community. Yeah, I think that just right now we really only have word of mouth. If you're a member of a larger group that's not because I think that most of the Netrunner specific groups are pretty aware of what's going on. But if you're a member of like a larger board game community on the internet or locally or something like that, if you find ways to drop it into conversation or bring it up, talking about what we're doing is really helpful.
Okay, yeah. I have another fun question before we close with whatever announcements you'd like to make, Zach.
Sure.
What card, and speak from your heart, you don't have to speak what's good for the game. What card would you bring back from rotation? One card, and why?
One card from rotation.
Or something that was removed out of the core set.
Right. That's very difficult. I have some taste in cards that some people might not really agree with. I, for example, really love Account Siphon. Yeah, okay, that's fair. I love Account Siphon so much. I think that Diversion of Funds is it's fine. It's okay. But I miss Account Siphon every day.
Diversion of Funds is like the LaCroix, and Account Siphon is the normal soda.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, actually. I mean, I do drink LaCroix all the time, I guess, but...
But it's just not the same as having a soda.
It's not the same. It's just not the same. That's true. Yeah, so, and obviously, Diversion of Funds and Account Siphon do not play well together. Having both of them is really, really too good. But I think that if I could transform Diversion of Funds into Account Siphon, that would be my pick purely from, like, selfish internal honesty. I definitely think that it is not a great first player experience and a bunch of other things that are wrong with the card, but I just really love playing with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great card that I also adore, that I think is very thematic. It's just also a misery engine for new people.
Yep, definitely. It's just like for most of the time that I was playing competitively, my general tournament strategy was take the best shaper deck, figure out how to fit Account Siphon in.
Yeah, seems good. I mean, that was the strategy for anybody who is not blue.
Yep.
Take your deck, find a way to fit 2 to 3 Account Siphons into it.
Absolutely.
It's not great. Yeah, or then if you're blue, you're just like, well, I'll start a deck, and I'll put 3 Account Siphons in, and then we'll build the rest of the deck.
Yeah, that's true. It is fair that it was pretty much auto-include for Criminal, although... I think that there's like a point where that's okay, right? Like Sure Gamble's been an auto-include for every runner ever for a period of time. So like there's a point at which it's just a piece of the faction's identity, right?
Right.
And it's acceptable then.
Oh no, yeah, criminals are allowed to use Account Siphon. That's their jam.
Yeah, maybe bring Account Siphon back with no influence bar. That would be pretty fun.
Whoa. I mean, I think there's things that you could do, but we'll see what happens with the design space, because I know that there are over half the board gave Account Siphon as their example of a card that they would bring back from rotation, including the leader of organized play and the developer. So, I have a strange feeling that the effect is not gone from our lives.
Yeah, well, I think that what you're more likely to see is more support for things with Diversion of Funds that make it like there's I'm so bad at card names today. Hot Pursuit, I think, is the other half of Account Siphon, right? Is that right?
Yeah, it's the one that Hot Pursuit's the one where you get a tag and you gain 9
and credits. Yeah. So I think that we're more likely to see things that sort of complete the puzzle of Account Siphon than actually seeing the effect again, just because Diversion of Funds does play quite well and doesn't play well with other cards that are similar to it. Yeah. I have very, very high faith in Greg's ability to make a game that is accessible, but that, brings back that sweet spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. When I had Greg on here, we also discussed the fact that there aren't as many ways that are strong cards to like toss credits like there used to be. Like it used to be, you could toss credits on big expensive things like Eve campaigns, Sand City grids, and like Ash was in like a ton of decks, and so were a lot of more expensive defensive upgrades. So people would just be like, bleh, and just like get rid of all of their money.
Right. I think
you can't have Account Siphon work where like every corp card is cheap.
Right. It just does. You can't play around it as well. I also think that a lot of the connotation with account siphon, right? Like there's definitely like a stigma against account siphon from the early days of the game where it was like this horrible negative player experience.
That's mostly people complaining, though.
Well, sure. But I
I'd
also think
rather.
that a lot of that comes from the fact that people just didn't figure out how to play around it, right? Like they would just res their Eve campaign as soon as they could instead of sitting on it in case, right? And I think
Right.
that after like 4 or 5 months, people figured out how to do that. And then Account Siphon was just a totally reasonable card for experienced players, at least. Again, obviously, it still has new player problems, but
Yeah, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
yeah.
So, Zach, before I let you go tonight, I want to say thank you for coming on, of course, but also I want to give you the opportunity to just kind of bring up anything or make any announcements. Sure, the mic is yours. Tell me what's on your mind.
Sure. You did such a good job of asking me questions. I think most of what I wanted to say, I've already had an opportunity to do so. I will reiterate a few things, which is the TLDR version of what I think is really important right now. Is get out there and tell your friends about Netrunner, and like if you think that they might enjoy it even a little bit, get them to play a game. We announced that we're doing Core 2019 as a way to like modify the card pool a little bit before our first like in-house design comes out. That product, the Core 2019 list, is actually designed to be a good way to introduce people to the game as well. We didn't do that with the intent that like a new player would hear about Netrunner and like go print out those cards or buy those cards or something like that and build those specific decks. That's really more supposed to be a tool for players to use to introduce people to the game. So like if you're a player who has some of those cards sitting around not in decks, please build the pre-constructed lists that we're putting out once that's all the way out. And use those as teaching decks. Like they're intended to be a good first-time experience. It's sort of a double duty with keeping cards around. But that is like a tool that we're trying to give you to get people involved.
Awesome.
The other thing that I definitely want to make sure that I say is participate in Game Night Kit events. If you know a store near you is doing one, if they're not, be sure to talk to them because store championship kits are going to go up in the next 3 or 4 months, maybe sooner. I actually can't remember off the top of my head when that's happening on the calendar. So if you missed the cut for game night kits, but you have a store nearby you that you think might run a tournament, make sure to let them know and send them over to nisei.net where you can buy all that stuff. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that covers it. And I think something that we actually talked about off camera before we started interviewing that I'd like to share with the audience. If you start getting people interested in the game or you bump into players out in the wild at game stores or wherever, make sure they know about the online spaces in which Netrunner is discussed, because something that has been blowing my mind as I've really kind of like dug into the effort of trying to keep the game going is that there are a ton of people who play this game a lot who don't know about the Slack, don't know about the Facebook group, don't know about any of the online spaces in which Netrunner is discussed. And that's tough because then their engagement is only based on when they can physically play in person.
Definitely. I've also personally at least found the local online groups are a really great way to get people into it because generally if you know someone who's interested in Netrunner but not playing yet, one of the biggest things that they're like concerned about is, being able to play the game and like having people to play with. And those local groups are a really great way to stay on top of like when the weekly meetups are and like where to go to play a game of Netrunner. And they can also just be a really good way to disperse information about what's going on.
I agree. Well, Zach, thank you so much for coming on and taking some time out of your Sunday, early evening for you, later evening for me, but really, just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dan. Thanks for interviewing all of the board members that you've been interviewing, and definitely thanks for just producing Netrunner content. It's really great to have a way for people to engage with the game other than playing it. And your show is just really awesome.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Everybody, links to all of the relevant NISEI information is going to be available in the show notes of this video on YouTube. Also, anytime you're watching the show on Twitch, if you do !NISEI in the chat, it'll bring up all of the relevant links associated with NISEI, including their website, sign-up sheets, etc. So everybody, thank you very much for watching. Take a look at what NISEI is doing. Make sure you keep on top of the updates that they're doing on nisei.net, and until we see you all again, always be running.